Good afternoon, and welcome to Unapologetic Educational Research, addressing anti-Blackness, racism, and white supremacy. Thank you for spending time with us today. This series is a collaborative effort sponsored by the Department of Educational Studies and the Qual Lab, both entities in the College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University. My name is Lori Patton Davis, and I have the pleasure of serving as chair for the Department of Educational Studies and as a professor of higher education and student affairs. I'm honored to serve as one of the series co-hosts. The purpose of the series is to engage our alumni, research communities, and general audiences in thinking about and reflecting on what it means to conduct educational research from a standpoint that honors Black lives in the research process, while also disrupting racism and white supremacy. Given this critical and turbulent time, we are committed to pushing the landscape of qualitative research and using this research to shift our socio-political context toward racial equity and justice. Each speaker within the series is a nationally recognized educational researcher and scholar. Perhaps most special is that each speaker is an alum of our college. We hope you find this series beneficial and educational. We encourage you to take notes, reflect, and consider your standpoint and role in the development and implementation of unapologetic educational research. I'll now turn things over to my colleague and thought partner, Dr. Penny Pasquay.
Thank you, Lori. Let me also share my welcome. We are so glad that you're joining us here today. Thank you. My name is Penny Pasquay, and my chosen pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a professor in educational studies and director of the college's brand new Qual Lab, which launched this past summer. We focus on advancing qualitative inquiry toward equity, diversity, and justice. As well, we focus on increasing the capacity regarding qualitative research within our college and beyond. I'm also an editor for the Review of Higher Education. Let me quickly share the outline with you. We've already shared the housekeeping slide, as well as we will put it in the Q&A for any late arrivals. But let me also take a moment to say thank you to everyone behind the scenes who have helped to make this series possible. This includes our Qual Lab graduate research assistant, Bakari Lamumba, our closed captioning team member from PRI, the Office of Advancement, the Dean's Office, and of course the Dean. In a minute, the Dean will introduce our guest speaker. After that, Dr. April Peters-Hawkins will share her research on unapologetic research with Black women educational leaders. I'm looking forward to it. Then we'll engage in a dialogue between Dr. April Peters-Hawkins and Dr. Lori Patton Davis and me. Questions from the Q&A will be coordinated by Bakari, so please feel free to use this throughout the session, and then he will add those questions with us toward the end. And finally, we'll take a few minutes to wrap up. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing you to the Dean of our College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University, Dean Don Pope Davis.
Dean Pope Davis, would you unmute your mic?
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Thank you.
My apologies. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. April Peters-Hawkins to you today. Dr. Peters-Hawkins is currently Associate Department Chair and Associate Professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at the University of Houston. Dr. Peters-Hawkins is a graduate of our college, having earned her doctorate in education policy and leadership with us. After earning this degree, she supported school communities in Baltimore, Maryland, as a high school principal, and in Atlanta, Georgia, as a consultant for the Institute for Student Achievement. In the latter role, she guided school leaders and teachers in implementing a small school reform model for high schools. As a researcher, she examines how school districts provide mentoring and support for early career administrators, the intersecting identities of race and gender for Black women leaders, leadership and urban small school reform, effective university and district partnerships, and leadership development, to name a few. An interesting piece about Dr. Peters-Hawkins is that she began her professional career as a teacher with Teach for America and was a founding faculty member and dean of students in the North Star Academy Charter School in Newark, New Jersey. Dr. Peters-Hawkins, welcome back to Ohio State. Thank you for being with us.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes, we can.
Great.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dean Pope Davis. It is truly good to be back at the Ohio State University, even if that is virtually. So I appreciate the invitation to be here. Before I get into the discussion about my research with Black women educational leaders, I have to do a few acknowledgements. So please bear with me. I would like to thank Dr. Penny Pasquay and Dr. Lori Patton Davis for the invitation to be here today. And then there are several others that I met along my journey while I was at the university, at the Ohio State University, that I'd like to acknowledge, even if they are not still with OSU at this time. My chair for my dissertation was Dr. Cynthia Uline, and I can't tell you how much I'm indebted to her for her support and guidance through that process and even beyond. Additionally, my committee was comprised of Dr. Frank Walter, Dr. Lynn Perez, and Dr. Valerie Lee, who at the time was the chair of Women's Studies, and by the time I graduated, she was the chair of English. And her role on my committee was invaluable to my understanding of Black women and theorizing about Black women. I'd also like to thank Peter Demerath and Patty Lather, who were qualitative research instructors of mine during my time there. Really appreciate all that I learned from them doing that. I have to thank Dr. Beverly Gordon, who I took classes with and who really helped me to build my foundation of knowledge about Black education and the experiences of Black folks in obtaining education in this country. While I was there, I also became quite familiar with Dr. Cynthia Dillard, who was an associate dean there, and interestingly, how life allows our paths to cross multiple times. Eventually, I graduated, moved on, and got a job at the University of Georgia, and now Dr. Dillard is at the University of Georgia, so it's good that we have crossed paths over the years. There are also, and my research is on mentoring, and I think it's important to acknowledge the folks who I've already mentioned, but others that mentored me along the way, informally. So I'd like to acknowledge Dr. T.K. Daniel, Dr. Bob Ransom, who was the director of the Office of Diversity and Outreach, it was called at that time. That's how old I am. And I was a graduate assistant in that office, and Dr. Bob and I had a great relationship, and I really appreciate what he did for not only me, but the other Black doctoral students who he was available to support at that time. Last but not least, I have to thank Dr. Cynthia Tyson. Now, there are a lot of Cynthias on my list, and they're all quite important to my development. Dr. Tyson was I was her GA at one point when I first started at the Ohio State University, and she has maintained her presence in my life as a mentor and just a tremendous force. She calls me her academic daughter. I call her my academic mother. She is an amazing person, and I just want to thank her. I think she's on, so I hope I make you proud. And then finally, I have to say, I have to acknowledge the two friends of mine who are also colleagues who presented before me, who are research powerhouses in their own right. So I just wanted to acknowledge D.L. Stewart and Rich Milner for the groundwork that you've already laid. And then hello to all friends, colleagues, family that may be in the virtual audience as well. Next slide. So I thought that we might start sort of at the beginning. When thinking about the research that I do, particularly with respect to Black women in educational leadership, I really start with the history of Black people in education. And I also have to say, I come to this work really with a Black feminist framework and perspective. And that doesn't mean that I only investigate Black women. I primarily do, but there will be times when I mention Black leaders in general. And so I just want to frame that at the beginning of this talk. In order to understand the current landscape of education and leadership, we must investigate the historical context that has given birth to this moment. And so the history of Black women in education is really characterized by a number of factors. I like to think that we first start out with this notion of agency. If we trace the history of Black education to the period post-emancipation, there's research that indicates that Black communities were very invested in creating educational opportunities for their citizens, mostly children, but some adults as well. And so what that meant was these communities donated the land for the schools. They built the buildings. They contributed funds to ensure that the communities actually had schools. This was no small feat because these weren't communities full of wealthy people. They were mostly built from people who were sharecroppers or freedmen. And often these efforts were led by Black women. And so as we trace the history of Blacks in education, Black women arise as prominent figures in this history. And as we note the agency that Black communities took to build their schools and to really chase after education and ensure education for their posterity, we have to also discuss the constraints, because these efforts weren't without constraints. And so, for instance, while some wealthy foundations made financial contributions to establish the schools, largely it was the communities, as I mentioned, comprised many times of short sharecroppers, who were responsible for financing these schools in the majority. Additionally, if the schools desired to have some sort of accreditation or connection to the local school district, they had to deed over the land to the local white school district. And of course, that also meant that curricular materials and facilities, et cetera, were not necessarily the same quality as those that were found in the white schools in those districts. Further, there's a history of physical and psychological violence in some communities, particularly where women, both white abolitionist women and Black women, started and ran schools, often schools for girls. There were attempts to burn the schools down. There were threats of physical harm to the school leaders and to the students. There were attempts to poison students, et cetera. And these kinds of events happened in the South, but also in the North, and even in communities that were comprised of folks who considered themselves to be abolitionists. So that history of violence is pervasive in thinking about the history of Black education. Further, in spite of the myriad challenges to obtaining education, nevertheless, Black women leaders persisted. They started schools, they trained others to become teachers. There's an impressive list of Black women educational leaders who were formally trained in elite colleges and universities, who then established schools or worked at schools that served Black children. The first school established for Black students by a Black woman was founded by Lucy Craft Laney in Augusta, Georgia in 1886. Ms. Laney is accredited also for training, notably Mary McLeod Bethune, who went on to establish Bethune-Cookman College, and was an advisor to presidents, but also Helen Burroughs, and many, many others. So in this pre-Brown but post-emancipation period, Black principals operated with a great deal more autonomy than we might think of today. Vanessa Siddle Walker shares this thought that the principal was able to implement a school program in keeping with their philosophy, and that they had the authority to hire teachers in line with the vision and fire those who didn't conform. And so there's this characterization of Blacks in education that includes the notions of agency, constraint, violence, and persistence. Next slide. As we think about how we bridge the historical and current spaces, though, we also have to think about the significant moments that punctuate this context. And one such moment is the Brown v. Board of Education decision. So it's important to understand that this decision impacted the educational trajectory, not only of Black students, but the professional trajectory of Black leaders, which I think is extremely important. In qualitative research, we are often presented with narratives or stories, and from those stories and narratives, we analyze to make meaning of those stories and to the people and for the people who are telling the stories. And I often discuss with my students that events have a meaning, or what I call the subtext. When we examine the history of Blacks in education, there's not only what happened, such as the landmark Brown decision, but also the subtext or the implicit meaning that such a decision had, what Linda Tillman calls the unintended consequences. So I published an article in the Peabody Journal of Education that came out last year that focused on desegregation and the disintegration of Black educational leaders. And essentially the subtext of the Brown decision was that desegregation closed Black schools and not white ones, and displaced Black educators and not white ones. And so that narrative is that Black educators, Black principals aren't fit to educate any children, let alone Black children, and especially not white children. And the effects of this decision have altered the course of education for Black educators and Black children. Often more emphasis is placed on actually celebrating the decision rather than the aftermath or the subtext, and the social, historical, and racist conditions that created the need for this case in the first place, and that actually still exist in the American educational system. So much like the historical context that precludes the moment, the education of Black children is still characterized by constraint and violence, evidenced by racial opportunity gaps, technology gaps, what Tara Chambers calls receivement gaps, zero tolerance policies, overrepresentation in special education, underrepresentation in gifted and AP classes, and the list goes on. And because Black educators are not present in schools, they are not in a position to influence the decision-making that impacts Black children in schools. There's a lot of research that suggests that Black students benefit from being exposed to Black teachers and Black leaders. And beyond those roles, Black educators have served as role models for children. There's research that Milner and Howard did that explicates that idea. Prior to the Brown decision, when critical masses of African-American principals were present in the schools of predominantly Black student bodies, those leaders would enforce and reinforce positive images and perceptions of achievement for their children. And that's a really important thing as we think about how we then move to bridge this historical space. Next slide. So researchers that examine Black educational leaders must also have the knowledge of the current historical context and the current landscape. And so as we engage in the research process, we often look to the research that's already been completed. And what we call the historical educational sort of research canon, it's often devoid of women's voices. So for instance, great man theory was not referring to Black women's leadership at all. And neither were the host of educational leadership theories and concepts that followed. I saw recently, I was reading something and I saw the word white stream written somewhere, and I like that. I'm sorry, I don't remember who wrote that. I would give appropriate attribution. But I like this notion of calling it white stream research, because to call it mainstream others, Black women and other minoritized groups, and it ignores and silences the theoretical contributions that have been made by these groups. So I suggest, I believe, and I know that the research that is by, about, and for Black women has a canon of its own. And so I have a small, just a sample of what I think is, some of the research that has been conducted on Black women leaders that provides a conceptual and theoretical basis from which to start when we think about how we engage in this research with Black women leaders. The body of work in the Countercannon provides insight into the ways Black women educational leaders actually lead. And so the Countercannon acknowledges and validates Black women's journey to and through leadership, thereby contributing agentically to the knowledge production process. And so I've listed there Tempered Radicals by the work that Judy Alston did on Black women superintendents. There are several articles and lots of research that folks have done about the ethic of care and Black women principles and how they lead. And then Tondra Loader has done some work in which she talks about other mothering, which is a term that Peters-Hawkins introduced into the research around how Black women take on the leadership role beyond just the narrow definition of what leadership is. Next slide. Sorry, I muted myself, I think. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. As part of the Countercannon, there are a number of conceptual approaches that researchers have used to study Black women educational leaders. I have them listed there. I'm not going to go through all of them. I will just say that intersectionality is listed first because it is an integral part of all of this sort of conceptual framework that we use to understand the experiences of Black women leaders, the multiplicative aspects of race and gender and other identity planes that impact the ways in which people lead, that are different from the white stream conceptual and paradigmatic research that explains leadership generally, but is not inclusive. But what I also want to get to is this notion of disruption of commonly applied conceptual and methodological framing, because my time is running short. And so I just think that those of us who engage in this kind of scholarship, it's been labeled unapologetic here, and I like that term a lot. Others call it emancipatory, equity-oriented, et cetera. But those of us who do this kind of work have a responsibility to critically engage in the research process ourselves. In other words, we have to invoke the Countercannon and envelop ourselves in epistemological and theoretical stances in our research, but we also have to be disruptive. So to paraphrase the late, great John Lewis, we have to create good and necessary disruptions. So what I've listed here is a couple of examples of how I've done that. I want to talk about the first one and then I'll move to conclude. The first article listed there is a chapter that I've worked, it's a chapter that I worked on with my colleague at University of Iowa, Ian Grooms. And what we do is take critical race theory and use it to disrupt rational choice theory. And in doing that, we acknowledge that rational choice theory has been applied in a colorblind way. It doesn't acknowledge the ways in which Black parents make choices for their children about schools. And so we're using critical race theory to disrupt that and to talk about the ways in which Black parents might make decisions about selecting charter schools for their children and how Black leaders might actually engage in that process in terms of building charter schools, separate and apart from the larger charter management organizations that we see that have been built for Black students. And I may get to the other ones in the questions and answers, but we can go to the last slide. So finally, I just think this about unapologetic research and researchers. We must be interstitial. So we have to acknowledge the significance of the educational history that precedes us and the relationship to the extant moment. Venus Evans Winters talks about blurring the space between research theory and practice. And I think we need to do that in order to really be grounded in the significance of these moments. It has to be revolutionary. We must speak truth to power. We have to call a thing a thing. We have to be unafraid to talk about race and gender and sexism and classism and racism. And we have to use research to interrogate power dynamics, thereby contributing to what I've been calling the Countercannon. And then finally, it has to be evolutionary. We have to be innovative in our ways in engaging in the data collection process. And we have to think about knowledge production. I have in quotes because I struggle with this notion of knowledge production beyond traditional spaces, including Rich Milner talked about a lexicon, right? And I firmly believe that what we call things matters, and we have to be continually embracing strengths-based lexicon and eschewing the things that are deficit based, that evidence a deficit mindset. And then we have to use empowering research methodologies in order to investigate populations of people that have been minoritized or marginalized, including Black women educational leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, April. Oh, that's inspiring. I am absolutely inspired and want to keep going. So let's do that. I really appreciate that you started with the historical and highlight the ways in which the historical and contemporary are intertwined when we talk about agency, constraint, violence, and persistence. What does anti-Blackness, racism, and white supremacy in educational research mean to you? We're asking that to all the presenters. Mm-hmm. How do you address these complexities in your research?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I love this question because these are complex issues, and we start with sort of just ways of knowing, right? And what it means to me is sort of who's left out of the conversation when we start to talk about theorizing and how people come to know or come to be, or what's the way to lead, right? And so much of what has been established in the canon is anti-Black, it's anti-woman, it's anti-Black, it's born of white supremacy. The great man theory is really only applied to rich, wealthy white men. And so I think how we address that is to be disruptive, to think, to theorize differently, to utilize, those things in the canon that have eschewed this notion that is not inclusive, but also considers itself colorblind, right? And then to continue to find ways methodologically and theoretically to study folks who are doing wonderful things in a different way. I think one of the things that's important about even the chapter that I was mentioning is that, we came to this place of saying, well, Black parents don't have the same value system about how we do school as other parents, and we can't superimpose one broad brushstroke over the way we do anything, including the way we do our research and the populations of people that we are researching. We have to step back and create that space, right, to learn and to theorize differently than what already exists.
Yes.
Thank you. So, of course, I loved everything you had to say because, like you, I studied Black women. But I wanted to go back to something you mentioned about Brown and this idea around displacement. And what it triggered for me in terms of educational research is, have you seen examples of how Black women's intellectual property, if you will, has been displaced when we look at educational research? And where I'm going with this, so one of the frameworks you mentioned was Crenshaw. And because there's such a popularity now with intersectionality, I often wonder, will she get displaced from, an idea that she was fundamentally, responsible, mm-hmm. At least the concept, mm-hmm. fundamentally responsible for creating. So can you talk more, I guess, from your perspective about how you see this displacement happening, either in educational research or broadly speaking, where Black women are doing the things you mentioned around innovating and crafting language and really helping us to think about and frame these larger societal issues, and somehow get swallowed up and erased in the process?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned this, because one of the things that I had on one of the slides was about sister circles, that which is a methodology that I initially came to learn about through a dissertation, but then a colleague and I employed that method to collect some data. But one of the things we did in those sister circles was talk about intersectionality. And we read an article that was an interview with Kimberlee Crenshaw, where she talks about what she really meant and then how that's really gotten, forgive the word, but bastardized in some settings, in some spaces, right? And one of the things I think is really important to do is to always sort of recalibrate. Like, am I using this terminology, this conceptual understanding true to form? Am I advancing the knowledge, the research in some way, but am I doing that in ways that really honor the folks who came before me and who really were pioneering, right? Who were agentic in doing this. So I think that I've tried to stick to that space, right? In terms of my own work and even what I consume, because I think you could get away from it if you just, if everything is intersectionality, right? Then nothing is intersectionality. And so I think it's important to think about who we are reading, what they've researched, how true that is to what the original intent is. And doesn't mean the intent can't expand or grow. I don't think that's what Kimberlee Crenshaw is saying, but we're seeing this used in all kinds of spaces that it's like, that's not what that is. And so I think, when we think about blurring the lines between research and theory and all that, what's really important is also adding teaching to that, because we prepare people for the field. And if we don't, make sure that they are tethered to these seminal scholars, right, then I think it's problematic, and people just sort of go off and they go rogue, and that's important to make sure that we're teaching and grounding them in methods and in theories that are really emancipatory in the way that they're intended to be.
It's so true. When you hear Kimberlee Crenshaw talk about her work, it is just wildly different than what I see cited in some people's work. And so as you're talking with the students that you work with about sister circles and non-dominant methodologies to center, not just be, counter, but to actually center Black women's research in theory and methods, what are some of the things that you share or teach to students, or would encourage people watching this here today to really fight for the ability to do this work in the academy?
Yeah, so this is a good question. I think, one, being well-read. This is what I tell my students all the time. Read widely, read broadly. Don't necessarily just accept what you've read as gospel truth, right? Like, find the disconfirming evidence. The other thing is, as you're crafting your own research, be careful about making assumptions, right? Because that's it, are you trying to learn something? Or are you trying to confirm what you think you already know? And those are two different things. And I think that's a powerful piece of this too. And then the time that it takes, like, it takes time to understand these concepts. It takes time to design research that really is unapologetic, and I think one of the things I think is that people are often in a rush to get it done. And this is one of the things about it's the tension, right? I'm going to veer off in a slightly different direction, but it's the tension in the academy of, being on a clock or, being on a timeline to publish things, and then knowing that in order to do what you need to do, it takes time for all of that to build a knowledge base, to set the research design, to engage with participants so that you build trust and so that you can execute the research in a way that has integrity.
So I think adding to that, I liked, the idea you mentioned around invoking the countercannon. And I wonder what you might share with those who are, trying to do that in their work, but structurally speaking, the canon is pushing back. And the representatives of that canon could be dissertation chairs, it could be our journals, lots of different spaces that push back when you try to, offer a different way or, different language or a different perspective about approaching research or naming educational issues in the research.
Yeah, that one is hard. It's there because there's no easy answer, because our journals do that, because there are some chairs that do that, right? That's the reality of it, just to speak that truth, right? And so I think that finding those spaces, one of the things I had to do as an early career scholar is just find my tribe, right? Find the folks who are doing, the work is being done, but, finding the space, finding the access to those folks who are doing that research, who can, who are writing these articles and books that can help guide us is important. Finding faculty across the college, across the university. Maybe if your chair is not that person, then having a committee member from across the university that is and can be an advocate. I think those are just, there's a strategy, I think, ultimately to all of this. You don't just walk out and say, I'm going to speak, this truth to power, and there it is. I think what happens is we have to be strategic about how we get these voices heard, which is why I appreciate this forum, not only for myself, but for the other scholars who have spoken and will speak, because it's a space for people to actually hear and learn something, because these things are not just always readily available in terms of what people sit in class and get from instructors, or even how they're taught to do qualitative methods, or even how they're ushered into their research design, or even how things may or may not be accepted or challenged for publication, right? Advocating for yourself with a reviewer to say, no, that's not what I meant, is, respectfully, so you can get published. But that's an important strategy and tool to use too, because, the answer is not an easy one. It's a hard one. And it's a constant, I don't want to say fight, but, there's the constant tension of that work.
Absolutely.
So I have one more question. I don't know if Bakar is getting ready to hop on here or not. Oh, I think I froze. Oh, okay. You talked a little bit about other mothering and these characteristics, I think, of Black women leaders in these educational spaces. And I wonder, I think I'm struggling with this myself as a leader. And so I understand Patricia Hill Collins, how she conceptualized other mothering. I know how she conceptualized it. I think when other people see Black women in leadership, their conceptualization is more like other mammying, right? Like, and so I wonder if you can talk a little bit maybe about how either your research participants or how you've seen other Black women sort of navigate this space between having actually a genuine ethic of care, right? But also not being expected to save the world, there's a lot of discourse now about Black women saving the election, and like all these places where Black women show up, and it's unhealthy for us. We are not saviors, and we're not magic. Like, there's labor, and so I just wonder if you could talk about how it's shown up for the leaders that you've interviewed or in the research, or how they navigate that tension.
Yeah, I think that's a great question also, because there is that tension, right? I'm a former high school principal, as well as a researcher of Black women educational leaders. And there is that difference of, the mammying that people may expect and the mothering. And so, and I think what happens, at least from the participants that I've engaged with, and also from my own experience, is that people aren't ready when you're like, I'm not the mammy. And because that comes off as different, right? That's like forceful. It's what people didn't expect. And so this is what many of the participants have talked about. Like, there's this passion for the work, passion for the children, a level of nurturing and co-ownership in terms of like this other mothering, right? This responsibility, but the pulling your fat out of the fire, or the other things that people expect me to do in the mammy role, there's a line drawn. Many of the women that I've talked about have acknowledged, that I've researched with, have acknowledged that exists, but have also said, and I'm not going to do that. That's not my role. And some of them have been, more forthright with it, and others have had to figure out a more savvy way to do that, because it depends on context. I interview almost exclusively in urban settings, Black women educational leaders. And, the work the work of an educational leader is tough no matter where you are. An urban setting adds more complexity to it. And what oftentimes I hear the women say is, I don't have time to be like mammying adults. I'm not doing that. And so I have to do the work that I'm supposed to do. And why I mentioned even in my presentation so much about education for children is because that's the connection. The purpose that Black women educational leaders have for the work that they do is what they do for the children, period. So that was my experience too. People were like, you're so warm and fuzzy with the kids. and not with the grown-ups.
Right.
Okay. So, that's the, the tension. And I think that, you bring up a good point that that's not something that I've overtly even engaged in, like as an instructor, to talk to folks about. And I think that's an interesting tension to maybe investigate, because our classes are really diverse, and it would be interesting to kind of have that conversation with some of our students who are educational leaders.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, Bakari.
Hey.
All right. Do you have some good questions for us?
Absolutely. I just want to first state to all of the attendees, want to thank you all for coming out and being part of our webinar this afternoon. And of course, to Dr. Peters-Hawkins for gracing us with your presence and your knowledge and your information in the conversation between yourself, Dr. Patton Davis, and Dr. Passaway. I'm just happy to be part of this. So we're going to jump right into the questions. We have a question from Javon Stovall, and he asks, could you say more about intentionally blurring the lines between theory, scholarship, and practice?
Yeah, so for me personally, those lines are blurred because I don't see myself sort of in this compartmentalized way. I don't see the work as compartmentalized. I will say that, as a student, I feel like I got a lot of the theory. And of course, as an academician, you continue to read and all of that. And then the research is done when you would conduct the research. And then the practice for me was actually, after all of that, going into the principalship and seeing whether or not the theory and the research actually bore itself out. In some ways it did, in some ways it didn't. But all of that combined to create sort of, for me, a research agenda that I then implemented as an academician. My husband is also a professor, and I always say that I'm an educator because of my experience, right, in K-12 space. And so all of that is blurred for me. There's, while I'm teaching, I'm also theorizing. I'm also researching. While I was a principal, I was also theorizing. I was also researching. While I was doing my dissertation research, I was also, engaged in practice in some ways. And so that's the way in which those lines get blurred. And for many scholars who do this kind of work, they, in qualitative research, we always say the researcher is an instrument of the research. I truly believe that. And then, you also think about your impact on all of it, on practice, on theory, on research. And so if, it's really difficult to sort of separate or tease one aspect of those things out. And that's how those three get blurred.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Passaway, Dr. Patton Davis, would you all like to share your thoughts on that question in terms of intentionally blurring the lines on theory, scholarship, and practice?
You want to go?
I appreciated your answer, April, about how it's always happening at the same time, that you are theorizing, a scholar, a practitioner at the same time. You're always in it and thinking. I think for me, there's a way in which, like, the epistemology, ontology, axiology, praxeology, the action of, right? Some critical scholars have taken axiology and split off praxeology because the ethics is not always showing up in terms of praxis. So I include that intentionally as a fourth one here. But how these are really connected often, that you can't always pull out one or the other, but they're all operating simultaneously. Mm-hmm. Lori, what were you thinking?
Yeah, I would say the same thing, that they're happening simultaneously. As I think about sort of, I have a circle in my head with arrows, going, it depends on what the issue is, or like how I'm entering in it to kind of know, well, am I starting with how am I theorizing, and okay, let's, practice, let's figure this out, or, do we go to research? So I think they're happening simultaneously, but I have had moments where I am like thinking more, I guess, methodically about how they link to one another.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we have another question that states, how do we address these issues verbally with colleagues who may be uninformed or simply choose to be adamant? What are safe spaces to disrupt people's thinking apart from educational research literature? And I'm glad I'm asking you all that question and I'm not being asked it. So let's put that out there, right?
Yes, the safe spaces is what's catching my eye right now. April, of course. Yeah, hear what you have to say.
This is a difficult one, right? Because people are entrenched in what they think and believe. I think, you know, having conversations helps, right? Presenting research helps. I will share that I recently was part of a group that did a common read, and that there were some challenges to that read because of the way in which the article spoke about disproportionality in special education and the failure of qualitative research to really address the issue and a lot of other things. And so it was powerful to have that conversation. And I will tell you, as a Black woman, one of the pieces of feedback I got. So a couple of things are happening because there are power dynamics and all of that are happening in this space, right? As a tenured faculty, I could say what I needed to say. But I don't always think that Black women can say it how they want to say it, right? We have to be a little bit more measured. And so a colleague texted me the next day and said, I just want to appreciate you for how you responded because, you know, there's the whole angry Black woman trope that you didn't get sucked into at all. You were just really professional in what you said. And so I say all that to say that there is the response, right? You can respond, you can address these things. I just think that, you know, you have to be thinking about that context all the time. I don't think that you don't speak truth to power. I think you do speak truth to power, but you have to know your context and the way to say that. So, and also the associated politics that go with it. And, you know, sometimes, quite frankly, we're tired. We don't want to speak all the time. But I knew that in that space, I had to be the one to speak. And so, and I did. And that's important too, because of sort of the political ramifications for other people who weren't at freedom to speak. So I don't think this is an easy thing, right? And it's like that racial battle fatigue that you have to go back and nurture yourself and then be prepared for the next thing. But it's also chipping away, eroding, you know, these thoughts, and also helping people to understand that there is no one way of being, one way to do things. There's a lot of cultural dissonance. It doesn't mean people are bad or whatever. It just means that we need to kind of come to a space where we can understand each other, but we have to be willing and open to do that. And it's hard because some people aren't.
Wonderful, wonderful. Would you all like to share, Dr. Patton Davis, Dr. Pasquay?
Say, you know, around the topic of safe spaces, it was interesting. I was in another meeting today where the person was saying that they didn't believe in safe spaces, but more around safe people who are similar to what you said, like who's your tribe? Who are the people you can go to in environments that are otherwise, you know, quite toxic.
Yes.
And so that's, you know, I think that's kind of sitting with me. But in terms of being able to disrupt people's thinking, like aside from educational research literature, I think there are other, I guess, types of, you know, literature that you can kind of lose yourself in that aren't educational necessarily. Like I've been reading Isabel Wilkerson's work, and you know, getting into that. It's not necessarily education, but it surely is educational. And it's I guess another safe space, so to speak, for me to be thinking and contemplating about, you know, I guess the context of education within the, I guess, broader society.
And yeah, thinking about the broader society and also institutional culture, that piece about safe space, interrogating notions of power in the academy, how it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. And I guess that's my word of the day, but it just really is like the individual level, what people are doing, and the politicking that are conscious and unconscious in that moment, but also within a system of, as you mentioned, April, tenure and promotion. Who has power? This image of the angry Black woman. If you get too loud, white people freak out, and then and that's all about power, maintaining a sense of control and power, and reproducing dominant white paradigms. That I appreciate what you both said about disrupting that, interrogating that, disrupting that, and also finding safe people or your community to be safe with. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Dr. Patton Davis, you let me know, give me the head nod on that. But our next question is from Antronique Flood. And the question is, how do we transition unapologetic research to pedagogical and curricular changes within graduate educational programs? And what they're stating is they are afraid that there is a performative interest in highlighting Black voices and anti-racism work due to the current heightened awareness of racial injustice and violence, that there will be no systemic change to carry us forward after the sense of agency or urgency is gone.
Yeah, to be honest, that's my fear too in a lot of spaces. Quite frankly, I think that it's, one of the things that in my space, I want to constantly push back against, are we doing this for the moment? Or are we doing this because it's the right thing to do and we're committed to it? And how does that evidence itself in all kinds of things, in our admissions criteria and our admissions processes, in the way in which we chair dissertations and set up committees, in the way in which we create policies, in the way in which we teach certain curriculum, right? All of that is part of the conversation. And I think it just, it's a conversation that has to happen. And I think the question is, who are we? And who do we want to be? And how do we get there? It's the question I've asked in my department. Is this who we want to be? Is this who we are? And if we're not who we want to be, how do we get there? And then what's the plan for getting there? Because we can talk and we can say Black Lives Matter and all of that, but unless we have some commitments that we verbalize and that we actually actualize, then we're just talking. And quite frankly, the last thing I'll say about it is, I don't know that most spaces, organizational spaces, can get there with the personnel that they have on their own. Because if we could, why haven't we done it already? Like, we need help, right? Yes. The whole point of this reckoning is that we need help. And so if the commitments around getting that additional support to make sure that we do this, and also information gathering. Let's ask people what their experiences are. Let's not assume that everything is okay with people and we're just in this moment. And then once we get past this racial reckoning moment, we'll go back to business as usual. But let's really understand from multiple points of view what people are feeling and what they need. And then let's make some movement to get there. Understanding that organizationally we may be limited and we do need some outside support, and then we need some commitments. And some of that means we're going to have to encourage some people to be somewhere else. Maybe not at the Ohio State University, and not at the University of Houston for anybody who's listening, but in some places.
Very good, very good. Wonderful. Well, I know we're about to wrap up, but Dr. Patton Davis, Dr. Peters-Hawkins, I know you all touched a little bit on the mammy presumption and how you all push back against that in the academy. But Dr. Patton Davis, you talked a little bit about other mothering in the work of Dr. Patricia Hill Collins. I want to know if just for our attendees, if you could just briefly touch on what Patricia Hill Collins meant by the concept of other mothering.
Okay, so I'm going to actually turn that over to April, since she cited Patricia Hill Collins. I know you know it, so.
Well, and I really came to this concept through Dr. Loader's work around what Black women principals did in their schools for students. I think it was in Chicago she was talking about. And essentially that was the way in which Black women really, took on responsibility to engage the students, right? To mother them, for lack of a better word, but in a way that forced them to, like what mothers do. It's not just like patting them on the back, but also making them take responsibility, holding them accountable, right? Listening to them, talking to them, that kind of thing. And so we find that happens in lots of spaces, right? Black women are often other mothers in their communities, in their churches. It's not just in schools, right? It's that piece of like equal, love and responsibility and accountability that happens. It's born out of the commitment to the community that they're serving in. So that's how I came to know of it. And when I read Loder's work, and I was like, that's what I did when I was a principal. I didn't have a word for it then, but I knew that, there was this overwhelming love and sense of protection and guidance that I wanted to give the children, because I saw so much at the 30,000 foot level that I knew they didn't see, and they needed an advocate in a lot of ways. And many parents are that, but not every parent is available to do that in the way that I am right there in the school building. So, but then that's also holding the teachers' feet to the fire to say, this is your, these are our children. This is what you're accountable to do to earn this check. So it's loving, but it's accountability also, from my perspective. I mean, in my perspective is entrenched in what happens in K-12. I know that that's not necessarily the way in which Dr. Hill Collins initially conceptualized it, but.
It works well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we're going to move to Lori next.
Yes.
Thanks,
Thank you so much for spending time with us today. It was amazing to hear your perspectives and just to learn from you today. You all can learn more about Dr. Peters-Hawkins' work in numerous journals, let alone these ones we have on the slide. So in the Peabody Journal of Education, the International Journal of Qualitative Studies and Education, and the Journal of School Leadership. So again, thank you so much for being a wonderful alum and agreeing to do this. One last thing I will mention to our audience is that our college is in the process of answering the call by fighting for diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice through our research, teaching, and service to the larger community. But we can't engage in this fight alone. And so we ask you to consider supporting this work through a donation to our Buckeye fundraiser. We have a goal of raising $15,000 by November 16th. So time is winding down, and we appreciate anyone willing to give to this great cause.
I'd like to echo my thank you to Dr. Peters-Hawkins, and also thank everybody for taking the time to attend today. I wanted to mention that there'll be a survey that you will receive right after this. We really appreciate hearing from you, so that when we do the series next semester, which I'm about to announce, that we can take your feedback into consideration. So as we move to next semester, these are a fabulous alum that will continue this series, because as we talked about today, the work is not done. We need to continue to disrupt and work on unapologetic research. All the videos will be posted up on our website, which is here at the bottom. And we really do need you to continue your own unapologetic research. So thank you again for taking the time and for being here today. And thank you, Dr. Peters-Hawkins. We will see you next time.
Thank you, guys.